The room between the hull and the deck was a comparatively small space, which meant it still had enough room for Shida and Curie to stand up, but would cause problems for anyone bigger than them. The floor of different rooms formed a weird mosaic of shapes above, each floor being fitted so that the gravity would be the same in every position. Each room was connected to the hull with multiple thick support beams, pipes and cables, connected to the different appliances in each quarter and workspace, came out of the floors, snaking along their underside and up into the walls, forming a mess of pathways connecting the rooms with each other and to the ship's core, where the power was being generated and water as well as waste was stored. They had to duck, weave and climb between metal pipes and rubber isolated cables as they sneaked on through the darkness. With soft steps, Shida traversed the dark space, all the while hearing the muffled footsteps of crew members above and the clanking of Curie's metal legs behind her. Suddenly, Curie's synthetic voice rang out, quietly whispering but piercing in the silence of the empty space. "Say, do you control your tail consciously, or is it more of a reflex?" they asked, while following her through the darkness and, apparently, staring at her rear. Shida figured they could probably see in the dark just fine with their mechanical eyes. "What?" she quietly hissed back at them. "Can we talk about this some other time?" "Oh, right. Sorry," Curie replied quietly, only then to pipe back up after a few seconds. "What about your ears?" Shida shushed them, shaking her head annoyedly. They slowly crossed the dark space, and every few seconds Shida had to block a new, intrusive question from Curie, who seemed to be simply unable to contain themselves. Shida really hoped they couldn't be heard through the floor, like they could hear people walking just above their heads. Finally, something changed. Shida sniffed the air. It smelled of soot and smoke. They were getting close, and while Shida was confident that she could orientate herself just fine, even in the darkness, it was probably time to step back a bit. "We're almost there. You take the lead from here," she told Curie, making way to let their wide frame pass her easier. Only a few moments later, they had found the gaping hole left by the fire that ravaged the laboratory. It had been weeks since, yet the smell of the chemical fire was still lingering. And even down here under the floor, dried remains of the thick foam they had used to extinguish it caked the ground and support beams around them. The laboratory lay just as dark as the crawl space underneath, so it was unlikely anyone was guarding the inside of the room. Without hesitation, Curie had lifted themselves up into their old workplace, and Shida could hear their steps clanking around above her head. It took her some more effort than Curie to climb into the room, since she had to lift herself quite high and had to be careful around the sharp and porous edges of the breach. She also really hoped Curie would keep quiet, while only the poorly repaired lab door, which had simply been somewhat hammered back into form, was standing between them and being busted. Shida couldn't see much in the dark of the room, but the damages to the walls were still enormous. She could feel excitement rise up in herself, fueled by a morbid curiosity as to what actually happened here. Sadly, she had to admit it to herself that she probably wouldn't be of much use in actually finding out the what, so she decided to let Curie do what they had to do and stay out of their way for now, opting to stay near the door and listening for any signs that they had been noticed. Curie rummaged through the room with a quiet precision they had not shown up until now, surprising with how completely focused they were. Each of their movements had purpose, each second they spent calculated. They lifted different parts of the debris and inspected them, before laying them back down. They simply followed trails that Shida could not see through the room, until they found what they were looking for. Immediately ignoring it once they had it identified, and instead turning towards the next thing catching their attention. Their foremost legs had once more sprouted the tubes ending in small mechanical hands, precisely handling everything that they studied. Shida sat in the dark, listening to each tiny sound coming from either Curie or from outside the door. Thankfully, the guards seemed to be fairly unenthusiastic about their position. They seemed to be fully content with their role of staring at the wall opposite to them, unmoving, and probably growling and glaring at passers-by who lingered or gawked too long for their taste. The thought amused Shida slightly, but she stayed on guard. Curie, on the other hand, did not seem concerned at all about being discovered. Sometime into their investigation, they began making longer pauses between each of their actions and re-examining some of their previous finds, most likely starting to connect the dots of each of their findings. When they had already spent minutes in the room, Shida's ears twitched, as she could hear something change, The walls and door, as well as the general ruckus in the halls, muffled them, but she was sure that she could hear voices, seemingly right in front of the door. Was somebody talking to the warden? She could not make out what was being said, but one of the people talking, who she presumed was the guard, definitely didn't sound too enthused about the conversation. It almost sounded like they were reprimanding someone. She didn't really get time to ponder that, however, because, finally, Curie stopped in their tracks, turning and glaring towards her through the dark of the room, still holding multiple items that Shada could not make out in the dark in their hands. Not wanting to make a sound, and hoping they could see her well enough to interpret it, Shada signed towards them. "Are you done? Found anything?" Curie was silent for a long moment. "I figured it out," they answered, verbally, causing Shada to flinch and quickly glance over at the door. Luckily, there was no sign of anyone having heard them yet, the conversation continuing, undisturbed. She signalled Curie to be quiet, but apparently they didn't even notice. "I figured it out, but what was the purpose behind all of this? It doesn't make sense, or does it? That was quite the contraption they figured out here, but what was its purpose?" They rambled on, not really being loud, but definitely not being quiet. Obviously having either completely forgotten, or paying no mind to the position they were in. What could be the reason behind such needlessly complicated actions? There has to be one. A train of thought. But what is it? Agitatedly, Shada hurried over to them, trying to shush them all the while. "Be quiet, damn it!" she whisper-shouted, trying to get their attention with waving hands. "Please be quiet!" They had to go, and they had to go now. Shada struggled to find a way to somehow coax Curie's spindly form around, trying to get them to let her lead them back towards the hole in the ground. But she found no ground trying to push any of their limbs, their legs just quickly moving out of the way each time she so much as touched them, and trying to move their body would only shift it slightly to the side. Then she heard the thing she had been dreading. Something was staring in front of the room. The guard had become active, and she could hear them getting even more agitated and shouting something, although she could not make out what it was. She could very much guess, though. "We have to go," she urged Curie, glancing back at the door. Meanwhile, the guard seemed to get more and more agitated, starting to yell more, but Shada wasn't listening. She was only trying to somehow get Curie to move, or at least snap out of their ramble. Then, a cracking and hissing sound behind her made her eyes widen. The door was loudly announcing it was going to open, the pneumatics struggling to move the barely repaired and crumpled metal into place. A small stream of light immediately began to shine through the first crack in the door, lighting up a small, vertical line across the lab's wall that was slowly getting wider. Shada saw the light's border slowly creeping closer to her body as the door opened wider and wider, and a now clearly audible and clearly unhappy voice thundered through the crack. "I don't care what you say. I definitely heard something in there." She could hear the sound of shoving and stumbling, along with a very quiet thud. Cursing under her breath, Shada realized that, Curie or not, it was now too late to get back into the crawl space before the door would open, and they would be busted. Giving it up, she let go of Curie's legs and quickly dove to the side, throwing herself behind the turned-over remains of a tool cabinet and pressing herself as flat to the hard ground as she could, trying to quell her heavy breathing. Curie stood almost in the middle of the room, unmoving and completely uncovered. Shada could only hope that they would not give her away, and the guard would be satisfied with having caught the intruder. The light from the corridor illuminated more and more of the room, now even falling on Curie's black body, and Shada quivered on the ground, clamping her fists, and fully expecting somebody to call out to them. Instead, she heard a sharp outcry of a familiar voice. "Ouch! No, damn it!" The voice of James, of all people, yelled out from beyond the door. Then she could hear struggling. "Hey, what are you—" The rumbly voice of the guard shouted breathlessly, seemingly caught by surprise by something, but James immediately pressed them further. "Quickly, after it!" he yelled, and once more there was the sound of struggling and heavy footsteps being reluctantly forced away from the door. "Don't just gawk, help me go after it! It's from a Deathworlder and it's pregnant. If we don't catch it, the whole ship will be infested in no time." That seemed to get people moving. The door kept slowly opening, but Shada could hear that no one was paying attention to it anymore. A cacophony of footsteps instead running away from the door, presumably after whatever James had let loose upon the ship. Shada thanked her lucky stars as she was peeking up over the debris. Indeed, nobody had reacted to the door opening and fully revealing Curie, who was still standing out in the open. But now, with the light shining in their eyes, they were apparently snapped out of whatever fit they had been throwing. Shada could imagine them blinking in the light, if they only had eyeballs. Deciding that fate had probably made his choice, and it would be now or never, Shida jumped out of her hiding spot, making a mad dash towards their exit. Curie piped up as she passed them. "Shida, what?" they asked, but Shida completely ignored them, crossing the lab in record time and practically diving into the crawl space, immediately starting to make her way out of there and back towards their escape. Behind her, she could hear Curie starting to follow after her, continually asking what was happening and why she wasn't reacting to them. Only after she had crossed the distance of more than an entire cabin block, Shida finally slowed down and exhaustedly leaned against one of the support beams. Her chest rising and sinking with each heavy breath, she threw her head backwards. It took a while for Curie to catch up to her again. Their black form crept through the darkness with their metallic rattle of each of their steps, slowly forecasting their approach. "Oh good, you finally heard me," they said, as they caught up to her. She had, but that's not why she waited. She was actually just winded. She had half a mind to just tell Curie off, but thought better of it, just clicking her tongue annoyedly instead. "So you finally back to reality? Done with whatever it was you were doing?" she hissed at them, glaring at their silhouette through the darkness. "Remember what we said about being quiet?" "Well, you said to be quiet unless you asked something of me," Curie answered plainly. "And the findings were too fascinating not to share them with you, but I figured that you would most likely couldn't see me too well in the dark, so I figured that signing wouldn't be the best option to communicate what I had to say." Had she not known Curie, she would have called them a smartass. "And it didn't cross your mind that people would probably hear you, did it?" she asked, exasperated by talking to the galaxy's dumbest genius. "Oh, right. I'm sorry," Curie answered so plainly that it would have been impossible to sound less sincere. As annoyed as Shida was, all she could do was sign defeat. After all, what Curie said was technically true, even though it only made sense in their own little world. Also, she had by now figured that it would be absolutely pointless to get upset at them. Instead, she would focus on the one thing she knew Curie would actually react to sensibly. "So, what did you find out?" she asked, while slowly extinguishing her anger and, having mostly caught her breath, continuing through the dark space. Curie excitedly began to relate their findings, while following her through the darkness. "It is fascinating, really. Took me some time to figure it out. Of course, I didn't have much time to prepare, and didn't really bring along the right equipment, so I couldn't actually conduct many tests I would usually have done." They began their utterance. "Under normal circumstances, it would have been much easier to figure it out, so I am still reasonably convinced that the team conducting the research should have been able to easily figure it out." Shida stopped and turned towards them for a second, looking them directly in the face and sternly saying, "Curie, the point?" before turning forwards again and continuing on her way. "Huh?" Curie let out confusedly. "Oh, right. Well, you see, I figured out that the contraption used to cause the explosions was made of an extremely tough outer shell, lined with some sort of highly conductive inner membrane. I didn't notice it while working on my experiment, because it was constructed specifically in a way that mimicked the construction or one of the holes of the supercapacitors used in the system. Of course, at the time of the experiment, for the system still attached to the external power source, the supercapacitors had not yet been built in, but the hole was still attached to the device to see if the heat would be able to damage it. However, at the time of the experiment, it had already been replaced with the explosive device, and the actual hull was curiously absent from the laboratory." They sounded awfully excited about something that sounded like it was very meticulously crafted and placed in order to destroy their work, Shida thought. They, however, kept explaining, untroubled. "I've also figured out that the device was rigged to explode once the experiment was running at full capacity. The explosion itself was caused by some of the power of the electrical coil in the melting chamber being diverted towards the device, where it was channeled for the inner membrane, which in turn started to superheat the water contained within it." "You are saying some water caused all of that damage?" Shida blurted out in disbelief, looking back over her shoulder, even though she could not see in the darkness. The tubes and cables blocking their way were pretty few and far in between, since most of them stuck close to the downside of the floors above them, so she wasn't concerned with running into anything. "Well, not just the water," Curie replied, sounding somewhat annoyed about being interrupted in their ramblings. "It was the whole contraption, manipulating the properties of water in order to generate the necessary pressure. The water started to vaporize under the extreme heat, which caused the pressure in the container to rise, which in turn forced the water to stay in a liquid state and heat up more, until a temperature was reached at which water could no longer be forced into its liquid state by pressure alone, causing it to evaporate in fractions of a second within the container, building up even more pressure, pushing against the outer shell, until reaching the point at which even the toughest material could no longer withstand it, and boom! The whole contraption came apart in one big blow. Shida could hear Curie excitedly gesturing with their forward arms, presumably making a wide arc, mimicking the explosion that wrecked their laboratory, the metal joints making a soft grinding sound. That all sounded awfully contrived just to blow something up. Why go for all that trouble instead of just planting an actual explosive? Curie did say something about those being very easy to detect, but if whoever planted it actually did have the power to keep people from further investigating, then what was the point in trying to make it hard to detect? Shida wondered if a usual inspector would have caught the contraption Curie described, or if it was actually only their knowledge of these specific parts not being supposed to be there that led them on to their discovery. "And you have no idea why anyone would have done it, correct?" she asked, just to make sure she had not misunderstood Curie's incoherent mumblings before. "No, not a clue," Curie responded. "I see no gain for anyone in destroying my machine or my laboratory in such a manner, but they do have to be dedicated. After all, they not only devised such a contraption, but they also had to meticulously design it to copy the make of my parts." That was a good point. How did they do that anyway? Wouldn't they have had to spy on you and your design for some time in order to do that? She contemplated out loud, while ducking under a particularly thick metal pipe hanging on the height of her head. "No, why would they?" Curie replied with a curiously upbeat demeanour. "The entirety of my work is recorded, logged, and freely accessible to anyone on the ship's computer system. I figured it would be better if anyone that could benefit from my work had the ability to easily do so." That did surprise Shida, if only because it was such a foreign concept for her. But it did explain how whoever made the device could design it to fit so well into their work that even Curie themselves did not realize it was there until it was too late. Even so, they did not reach any further conclusions about the reasoning behind the plot before they had once again reached the maintenance hatch they had entered the crawl space through. Before they left, Shida stopped Curie and, in small steps, explained that they should not talk about it anymore as long as they were out in the halls among other crewmates, and how they should only discuss this whole situation in private. To her surprise, it actually seemed to sink in. Curie appeared to listen carefully and, after Shida was done explaining, repeated the biggest points back to her, making gestures of understanding. Shida nodded back at them, pleased that explaining everything indeed seemed to work, even though it was slightly annoying to break everything that seemed so natural to her down into such small details. Curie stayed quiet during their entire journey back through the ship, probably not wanting to talk about anything but the topic at hand. Shida was just fine with that, using the time spent walking in her thoughts, mulling over their situation once more in peace. Due to it having taken some time for them to traverse the crawl space and the ship back to the research wing, the chaos that James had caused earlier had already died down again. Looking down the hall, they could see the disgruntled guard in front of the broken lab door, having taken back up their position of standing and staring at the opposite wall. They were a medium-sized decapod. Their long antennas swung through the air wildly, scanning it for any hint of things that might try to come close to the door they were guarding, completely oblivious to the fact that they had already failed in their task. "Do you think James is back by now?" Curie asked, as they reached the gates to his workplace, and momentarily paused. "I wonder where he was going when—" They stopped when they noticed Shida glaring daggers at them, probably realizing they almost gave themselves away. Shaking her head and turning away from her metal companion, Shida answered, "Well, there's one way to find out."